This is our second presenter, so I'm very pleased to present newly Dr. Scott Harrison. Obviously because of his supervisors, who are all very, very important. But in all seriousness, it is my pleasure to introduce Scott and his full paper on measuring financial implications of an early alert system. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Grace, for the introduction. Before I even go to the first slide, I'll just preface this with the disclosure that any views and opinions I share in this session are strictly that of the authors, and when I say authors, I mean me, not necessarily shared by some of my co-authors, but certainly not the institution. So these is very much my own thoughts at the time. So what we will be working with is basically an early alert system that was instituted at a case study institute. And so what I'm going to work through is what I call a two-part act today. We have the foundation, which lays the groundwork, giving you an idea of the frameworks that we're working with and some of the questions that we wanted to test, and the modelling and the data set that we used. In the second part, we'll get on to the fun stuff, which is the results, when we start really breaking things down into the financial constructs. And I really want to try and get through the foundation step as quick as we can and try and leave as many opportunities for questions at the end, because I'm sure there might be a few. So I should also point out that unlike the keynote yesterday, which was a cartoon-driven presentation, we could only afford one stock image. So I've just reused it and put it through several things. This is Google Deep Dream. But that also leads us on to some of what I would call the hard questions when we're dealing with early alert systems. So I see that, the questions that are inevitable in many ways that are going to be asked about institutions that want to have early alert system programs is, how much should an institution spend to attain improvements in student outcomes? Do early alert systems have a positive return on investment? And if so, by how much? And if changes are made to a system, that is, we go through a process of reinventing or improving based on previous observations, how can those changes be quantified? So I call these the hard questions because as far as getting the data to answer some of these questions, it's incredibly difficult, yet they're questions that we need to be asking. But that leads us in many ways to what I call the easier questions. So in this case, what we're directly addressing in this paper are what are the financial implications of a student when they disconnect or discontinue their studies. We have, what is the overall effect of an early alert system on revenue? Are all of the schools within an institution actually affected in the same way, or is there some degree of variability? And more importantly, this really gets to that question of should early alert systems be an institution-wide approach, or should we be looking just within the individual schools? And then finally, does the early alert system itself retain value over time? So this is what we're addressing in this particular paper. Now, when I talk about the case study institution, it's an Australian institution, so all of the financial figures that we're going to be talking about are in Australian dollars. And I wanted to include the map on the left-hand side just to give you an idea as to, this is just the east coast of Australia, sorry for the west coast and South Australian people. They always get that. So, but you'll see that outside of our major centres of Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne, there's still a number of regional and smaller metropolitan universities. So the one that we were working with in this particular study is a university with over 20,000 students. It has what we call 10 traditional schools, so we're working with a arts, science, business, health sort of background. And one of the really interesting features that you'll notice is that 79.9% of enrolled students were studying off campus and online. So this is an institution that specialises in distance education, and also that 65.7% of the cohort is female. So it has a strong history in supporting diverse backgrounds and in an interesting sort of aspect of this, there's also issues for the regional universities all throughout Australia associated with retention. So this is a major question where we're looking to early alert systems to help innovate. So the framework that we're using is, in the early alert system itself, is 34 triggers or indicators. I've just put a few up there. So we've got indicators like whether or not they were from an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background, which is a racial identifier. The early alert system also had whether or not they were staying in a residential college at the time or not. And also we had other elements from the learning environment like portal inactivity. How long had they been inactive from logging into some of the online portals that were available to students? And the idea is that every day you have this information being, or the student information being assessed against these triggers, and it generates a list that goes to our student support team of 200 top-ranked students who are deemed to be at risk of disengaging. And that was associated with the original design parameters of the early alert system, not the modelling that we conducted. So the idea is then that this list will help inform what happens in the next steps for the student support team. So if we condense that down into the early alert system itself, we then have the overall framework that we're working with in this particular paper. So we have students who come in, they're enrolled into the institution, and on a daily basis they will go through being assessed against this early alert system. And when they're identified, they will be fed into the student support cycle. If they're not identified, they can either continue on to be still enrolled in the institution or they can discontinue. And likewise, after the student support interaction, they can go to either discontinue or enroll and then eventually complete. So this is going to be the framework that I'll keep coming back to when we're talking about the results. You'll see it used a lot more. I want to get on to the particular method of modelling that we use, which is what we call treatment effects modelling. And this is a type of modelling that is causal in its inferences and capacity to make inferences in a causal framework. So if you're not familiar with the causal conundrum, it's the fact that if we apply a treatment to someone or we don't apply a treatment, you can only ever observe one of those outcomes. For an individual, I can't see what would happen in both circumstances. So if we give someone a particular treatment, we can only see the outcome under the condition of being treated. And vice versa, we can only really observe the outcome under the condition of not being treated. So what does treatment effects modelling do? We come up with the idea of imputing the missing outcomes. That is, if I was a student who was identified by the early alert system, we use an imputation method in the algorithm to identify, okay, what would have happened if I had not been identified. Okay, and this is based on, the other cohort. So the idea is then after we impute those missing values, we can come up with some average treatment effect. Okay. Now, within treatment effects, there's many different approaches within this statistical modelling process, and the one that we chose was the nearest neighbourhood approach. It falls under the banner of what we call propensity score matching, and if you're really interested, I would highly recommend going and reading Caliendo and Koenig. It's a fantastic paper that basically gives you a run through from beginning to end as to how to implement a treatment effects approach to analysis. In the nearest neighbourhood approach, what it enabled us to do is ensure that we're matching those characteristics between, if I was in the treated group, I want to match on the characteristics and be assessed and have my values imputed from someone who is just like me in the non-treatment group. And what we have is a situation where, in this diagram, very simplistically, we just had different colours representing different gender and the S's representing different schools within a university. So we can tell that within the treatment effects model that I only want to match people from the same school who are enrolled in the same space. I only want to match people on the same gender. And the idea is this helps us start controlling for some of those factors that would affect different outcomes. You'll also notice that in the case of the far left-hand circle there, S9, there's no match. And this is actually a feature that will sometimes happen. Sometimes you will have people who there is no match for. And I'll explain that in a little bit when we start getting into the sample sizes, because you see it varies. So the data set, again, okay, Tyrannosauruses in the data set didn't actually happen, but I figured it was a good addition to the stock image. We had over 16,000 students in the data set, and we had a number of variables: gender, age, ATSE, fee type, prior studies and so forth, Importantly, the ones with the little asterisks next to them are the ones that we matched exactly for in the algorithm. Another thing that I didn't say just before, but when we go through the matching process, we can actually say don't match just one person to one person, we can actually say map 1 to 4. So the imputed value that I would receive means that there's a stronger estimate associated with what my expected outcome would have been. So let's get into the results, and this is where it gets really interesting. So the first thing we were interested in the research side of things is what's the cost of discontinuing? What happens when a student drops out? How much does that cost the institution? And we found that when a student drops out, on a per student basis, it's over $4,600. That's how much the institution loses on a per student basis. And you'll see the sample size there was about 13,690. I should also preface that all of the results are significant at the 1% level when we're doing the testing. If we then compare that to what would have happened if someone who dropped out would have completed, the value is much higher. It's around about over $7,000 is what the institution's losing when they don't get a student to complete. So we can then take this information and we can infer some very important information about that. That is, if we were to improve the retention rate at the case study institution by 1%, how much additional revenue are we expecting to get as a result? And so you can see here that in the years of the study, a 1% increase in the number of students in the space that we had is not overly huge. However, a 1% increase is starting at least $500,000 of additional revenue. So it's not a small amount that we're talking here. And I'll also point out my background being in econometrics, we took a very conservative approach to some of these estimates. When we talk about the implications then of the identification process itself, we looked at it from the other angle. That is, what happens if you go through the identified pathway to the not identified pathway? And what we found is that if you went through the identified pathway, through that student support space, you would find there's about an extra $4,000 per student. And to us, that's an important finding. I'll get onto the causal inferences of that in a little while, probably towards the end. But what we can say at this stage is we can't necessarily say the EAS itself is causing an additional $4,000 of revenue because we don't have the information or data within the student support box itself as to the types of support that was received. But this is still, a step in the right direction. If we then look at the implications of EAS identification under the condition, or the cost of discontinuing under the condition of being identified, we can see that if you were to be identified by the early alert system and then dropped out, the institution's now losing a lot more money. There's value in going through that pathway, but the institution's going to lose around about $5,000. If they, however, were not identified and discontinued, it's a lesser thing. So on this particular note, it's important to look at if we go through the process of providing early alert systems and we're supporting students and then they go to drop out, there's a higher risk and a higher cost associated with that. But that also means there's a higher potential for gain. If we look at the values then at the school level, one of the really important things you'll notice is there is a high degree of variation between the financial effects of the early alert system within the schools. So you can see that the maximum value there is over $6,500 per student if someone from that school was retained, all the way down to just over $2,000. And it's easy to start thinking of, okay, well, should we be trying to focus our attentions perhaps in some schools because they're worth more money and not others? No, I do not support that conclusion whatsoever. I think the really important take-home message that we got from this was that at every single school, whether the effect was smaller or larger, there is still value in the early alert system across the institution. And more importantly, another factor that's here caught in this is that different schools can charge different fees relative to what they're teaching. Okay, so there is an effect there that we couldn't disaggregate out, which can help explain some of that variation. So When we then looked at, okay, does the early alert system itself keep its value over time? How we were addressing this was we wanted to look at, okay, if I take a student who's picked up in the first year of study, okay, when they're identified in that first year, which has been a major focus of most of our retention efforts, we could calculate that, okay, those students identified in the first year, it was around about $4,000, similar to what we calculated as the overall net effect of the early alert system. However, you will have some students who were never identified by the early alert system as being at risk until perhaps the second or the third year of study. And so the question is there actually value in having the system run across all of our students if it's not actually maintaining value? And the good news is, yes, there is still value to be found. It decreases a little bit in the second year, okay, and in this case we found it was about $2,500 per student. But by the third year, the sample size, I will point out, is a lot smaller, yet it was still significant, and it was still over $3,500. Okay, so students who weren't picked up by the early alert system as being at risk until their third year of study, there was still a financial benefit there. So I'm coming to the summary already because I know that there's going to be a lot of questions about what we just did. I guess the key points that we really want to take home on this is that treatment effects modelling, for a start, is, I would regard, as one of the most appropriate methods that we can use to look at it, not only assessing early alert systems, but even other learning analytics initiatives. If we have the right data, we can look at how we can create that causal inferences about whether or not the learning analytics initiatives we're implementing works. We can see that the cost of discontinuing is high, but so is also the implications of being identified and going through the early alert system process. And so there's an incentive there for the university to really support those students. And as we said, not just getting them through whatever phases to continue to be enrolled, but getting them to completion is actually a strong financial incentive for every institution. And we can see that despite the variations that we're looking at, we can see that, yeah, okay, there's value in having institution-wide systems running. Now, I know that that's not necessarily easy for larger scale institutions, but I think this shows and demonstrates, at least on some level, that it's possible to make this work. And more importantly, that the EAS itself maintains value over time. So if we had more time to get more data, especially in our third year identification students, it'd be great to have perhaps more robust estimates, but what we saw there is still value associated with the system in that third year and second year situations. So I see where to from here is, we know that from our study there's a need for additional data. There's some causal inferences that we would have loved to have been able to make and say to you guys with 100% certainty, yes, it works in this particular way. However, we see that that's actually now laying out the foundations and the groundwork for us to be able to start doing better evaluations in the future and hopefully lay the foundations for other people to build off this and implement the types of modelling that we use in their own institutions. So at that point, I will conclude and open it up to any questions and see how we go from there.
Thanks, Scott. Questions for Scott?
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. It was really interesting. But I have some questions about Jeffrey's treatment effect. I'm wondering, but I'm not sure if I understood very well.
Yep.
But you did matching.
Yes.
So you matched one student with another student which didn't have any early warning. Is that correct or not?
Yes.
So you have student A, which is comparable to student B.
Yep.
A has early warning.
Yep.
And B doesn't have. But you probably, don't you have the chance of having an omitted variable bias? Because there is something that why this student B is not having an early warning. So, I'm thinking that maybe you have things you don't measure which are still important. So my question is, do you think the matching is correct, or What do you think of it?
Okay, I guess this is more coming to the fundamental process associated with treatment effects, is that the idea of the matching is to control for both the observed and unobserved variables that happen in that space. So we're assuming that, okay, if we match directly on two students in the same course, there's things like the material that those students are going to be taught is the same. We don't need a variable for the course content or what's happening in that space, because we can make a reasonably valid assumption that those two are the same. Another key point is that, as I was saying briefly, and I'm sorry if I sort of went a bit quick on that, in the method that we used, we didn't just do a one-to-one matching. What we did is we would go, okay, here's one student, I want to find the 4 closest neighbours to that student. And what we do is we take the states of those 4 students and the estimated revenue from those, and you average that, and then that becomes an average in itself of the imputed value. So you, in many ways, create a more robust estimator of that. And even though, yes, there's going to invariably be with every statistical model data that's missing or perhaps invalid, or not counted there, I feel that the matching algorithm, the assumptions associated with it, is still very robust. And I'd encourage you to have a little bit more of a look into treatment effects modelling as to how it works, because it's been widely applied in a number of different spaces. So this isn't a method that we developed.
Yeah, but normally there are 2 groups, and one of them, they are independent. That means that you match, for example, groups which are on different schools, and then you match them. But now you match in the same cohort, and there is still a difference, because one of them is receiving treatment or rewarding, and the other one not. So there is a difference between them, because otherwise they would have received both the same thing. So there is a difference.
Oh yeah, and that's what we're measuring. That's what we're trying to measure, is what is the difference between these 2 groups, based on the assumption that they're identical on every other characteristic except for that.
Thank you. Mariki Potgieter from South Africa. I assume that with the implementation of the early alert system, more students would need intervention. Therefore, you would need more staff to provide that support. So have you also calculated or estimated that cost into your equation?
Okay, so this is where we go to that wonderful space of data limitations and the types of things. So with our data set, what we could see was which students had been identified and which hadn't. But as far as the student support black box is concerned, this was an off-limits space. We had no information about what was actually happening within there. So,
But
yeah.
I'll jump in there. We did not increase student support staffing over the 4 years of the study. It stayed the same. So the student support services, even though we were identifying students, there was no financial increase in the tutors or student support services staff. We were just utilizing their time differently at different peak periods of the semester, but we did not increase staff numbers.
Yeah.
My question is,
Have you taken consideration into the effects of having a higher retention rate? So not just the students that are already enrolled, but any prospective students that might be coming in?
So hang on, sorry, could it just get a little bit louder? I couldn't quite hear it. So.
Have you taken consideration the effects of having a higher retention rate for the university? So not just the students that are already enrolled, but for prospective students?
Yeah, no. So this is purely just observational data that we couldn't really incorporate. The idea of looking into the future. This isn't a predictive model by any means. So no, unfortunately not.
Question in the back here.
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting stuff. For purposes, a suggestion and then a question. For
Yep.
purposes of matching, it would be very interesting to include variables not just in terms of what course a student is enrolled in, but the student's level of prior knowledge and the student's level of engagement, because those two are certainly differentiating students in the 2 conditions.
So actually, on that particular point then, there's an interesting characteristic associated with the theory of treatment effects modelling, because this particular method comes from especially the medicine and clinical trials background. So one of the really important things with treatment effects is that you should not include variables that themselves can be affected by the treatment. The variables should be independent of the treatment. And so there's a very real possibility. There's a reason why we didn't include grades and grade outcomes, is because even though we had that data, if you get engaged within the system of the student support system, there's likely to be a very positive effect on your grades, which is then going to create a recursive error in your model itself. So that's one of the considerations that we have to have in terms of how we specify the model when we do it.
Thank you. And the question is, if you could go back one slide.
Yep.
I would have expected the value of the EAS to decrease year over year, but it spikes in its third year. How does that work?
I would not say spiked, because there's no down on the other side in the fourth year. We don't have that. But what I would be saying, the important thing that you have is a decrease in sample size. So there's a limited number of people who got identified in that third year. The decrease in sample size increased our variability. So you can see that the standard error, which is represented below, so the standard error increases. And then that obviously has an effect on that. We know that the third year estimate is still more highly variable, but it was actually still significant at the 1% level. And that was an important thing for us.
Do you have any hypotheses for what might cause such an increase in the third year?
I'd simply say it's just a random noise, increased variability associated with the limited sample size that we had at that.
I mean, it's more than 2 standard deviations, I believe.
Yeah, but in comparison to the previous year, as an increase, I don't think interyear comparison is quite valid at that stage. We would definitely need more data, I think, before we would. If it was me being able to do this again, I would run it again if we had more third year observation. The problem is the early alert system itself and how we specified the model means that statistically you're just going to get less students being identified in that third year. They're more likely to be picked up earlier in the process. So it's a little bit harder to infer in that stage.
About, I think, 4 or 5 questions back, you said that... One question. 4 questions to rephrase. Sorry. You said that those who get treatment and those who don't get treatment are identical except of that. What was this that? I missed it.
Identical on the basis of every other characteristic except for the treatment itself. So the treatment of being identified or not identified, so basically you should have students being exactly the same going in, except you've got one who is not identified and one who is. And that's the difference that we're calculating, is what is the difference in the financial outcomes of those 2 students.
Scott, I'm curious, not so much about the model, but how the university loses money by a student failing a course. From the state, I'm from the States, and my university, at worst, some other student will come in and fill the seat, and it's sort of neutral. At best, they take the course a second time, and the university actually makes more money.
So, okay, so this is it's a good point. Like, they don't actually lose that money. I would say it's lost in an economic context if that's an opportunity that they could have had to have retained someone for longer, and kept that funding. I think there's some really good research on that space as well, and I think this really goes into that of the costs or the benefits of retaining someone actually outweighs the costs of recruiting people to fill that space. So.
Hi there.
Yeah.
Returning back to that question of why the figure is higher in third year, I was wondering if it's not related to the system in Australia, if I think I got it right, that government pays for finishing students. So any finishing student is actually of higher value than anybody who's in the queue earlier on. And I don't know if that could have an effect on this.
Unfortunately not, no. So the revenue calculations themselves was taken specifically from the units of study that they were enrolled in, and we multiplied that out by the cost per unit into an estimation of their overall financial fee, which in itself was an estimate. So we didn't actually have the financial values for that, but it doesn't take into account government funding or anything like that. The modelling is purely just the student fee side of things.
So in terms of type 1 and type 2 errors in predictive models, one is more costly because the student goes along and you support them and then they fail. Did you check that that was consistent across the different faculties?
Thanks, Alan, for the question. No, we didn't actually check, not in this analysis anyway, about the type 1 and type 2 errors associated with the early alert system. It'll obviously be an issue that we want to look into, but I think actually, the bigger issue is actually pulling apart the student, sort of the next step in the early alert system process, which is who opted in for support and who didn't. If we had that, we could probably provide far more clarity on the causal effects of both just being identified and not doing something about it versus being identified and actually taking action on that identification. So that's really the next space, and anyone who's looking to do an evaluation of an early alert system, that's the information you need.
And that's my next PhD student. That's what she's doing. We're actually looking at what were the interventions, what happened, how. So we're getting into the black box. We're seeing what's there and saying, if this was the intervention, what happened and following them through over time. And we are doing a longitudinal temporal analysis of inside the black box. So stay tuned for LAK'17 and we'll have some results there. So thank you, Scott. Please join me in
Thanks
thanking
very much, guys.